Hi, and we're back. My name is Robin Swanik, and I am the Associate State Director for Community Outreach with AARP Nebraska. For the last few months, we've been giving you some virtual events to attend from the safety of your own home. At some point, we'll like to be back out into the communities giving our AARP presentations on information, education, and fun. But in the meanwhile, as we're going through this pandemic, we're going to do it from our computer. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look inside the history of the Hastings Museum. That's right. For the month of September, we're going to visit them 5 different times so we can learn about different parts of their museum. This episode is being shown on Facebook Live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time. Now, after each of these events, if you are unable to join us, you'll still be able to see it from our Facebook page at AARP Nebraska. When you do go look at it, if you like it, make sure you let us know or even share it on your page so others can see what you got to learn from AARP. Now, today is going to be part 1 of the history of the Hastings Museum. And I have with us Teresa Kreitzer Hodson, who is the curator of collections at the Hastings Museum. Hello, Teresa, and welcome aboard.
Hi, Robin. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate doing this.
It's good to have you. And you have so much to share, and we're excited. So I'd like for us to get started. Like I said, today our first event is about the Hastings Museum. And actually, is it the history of the Hastings Museum you're going to tell us about?
So today I'm going to talk more about how we were founded, so the early years of history, and really who our founder was, because he was a very interesting man.
Great. Well, I'm excited, Teresa, so let's get started.
Awesome. So like I said, I want to share the story of the Hastings Museum and our founder, Albert Brooking, and his journey to building this museum. The picture that you see on your screen right now is what we look like today, but this isn't always what we look like. So we're going to talk about that, and I'll share with you some interesting tidbits about Albert himself. Next slide, please. So Albert was a man with many interests. Long before founding the museum, he dabbled in numerous hobbies and careers. But above all, he really enjoyed music and he loved nature and collecting specimens. He learned to play the violin at an early age. And the really fun thing about him, I think, is that he continued to play throughout his life because he enjoyed it so much. But anywhere that he lived, if there was an orchestra, he played in it. And if there wasn't one, he started one. That was how passionate he was about playing. And as far as the natural history stuff, he had a curiosity for nature that led him to become kind of an amateur biologist and amateur ornithologist. Pretty much anything he did, he became an amateur at it. He didn't study at college, or he didn't study under great masters, but he always sought the right people to learn this and was an avid reader and just really studied a lot of stuff. He shared his interest in birds even with Nebraska and started the Brooking Bird Club in 1920, which predates the museum. But this bird club was pretty important. They helped with winter bird counts. They documented sightings of birds and associated habitats. They organized bird watching tours throughout central Nebraska. And what's really cool is some of their observations are still studied by scientists today. Next slide, please. So how did Albert get his passion? He was born in 1880 in Illinois, and he moved to the Axel-Minden area here in Nebraska with his family when he was very young. By the time he was 7, his parents had finally settled near Funk, Nebraska. And at that time, he was really curious about Native American culture and history. But this area doesn't really have a strong association with any tribal settlements or site locations that we know about. But the birds are abundant. And if you're not familiar with that area around Funk, there's a very large wetland still today that is home to a wide array of waterfowl and migratory species. So Albert did what was natural and started studying the winged inhabitants, and this kind of sparked his lifelong interest in birds. And then, you know, the other animals that came in along with it. The slides show a picture of Funk, the main street, and then the other one is actually where they family lived. The front of the building was a store, and then they lived in the back like so many places, or so many people did in these early places and towns. Next slide, please. So his study drew him to start collecting bird specimens, and he got pretty good at teaching himself taxidermy on these specimens, because once you gather them, of course, you have to do something to preserve them. And so there really weren't any books out there, so he tried a lot of different things, and it was basically trial by error. He got good enough at mounting birds, and then he moved on to some other animals. And at first, his mounts weren't that great, but of course he got better, and he was able to sell some of these mounts and make money and share more of his interest in nature. His poor mother endured his hobbies because he was doing this while he was still living at home, and she allowed him to store his collection in their home. In fact, he even said he had some overflow that ended up in an outbuilding, and he used that as his museum. If you look at these images, you'll notice that some of them look really odd, particularly the bobcat and the wolves. Faces are really hard, and it's not unusual for this time of taxidermy for these animals to just kind of look kind of weird. Like I said, there was no books, there wasn't a school to teach the art of taxidermy, so people like Albert just basically invented their own methods. And I'll talk more about taxidermy next week in our next segment where we talk about our animal dioramas. Next slide, please. So, like every good parent, you want your kids to get a job and support themselves, and Albert's parents weren't any different. His first career choice was fitting and selling glasses. They sent him off to college in Chicago at the Northern College of Optometry. He got his degree, his certificate for fitting glasses, but he didn't have enough money to come home. So he ended up having to work his way back to Nebraska, fitting glasses all along the way. Once he got back here, he went into business with Charles Morgan, and he was a jeweler, and they became partners in a business in Holdridge. Kind of sounds weird that you would have jewelry and glasses in the same store, but at this time that was kind of the norm. You would have people who would come in to be fitted for glasses and to pick up a ring. Brooking only lasted here about a year, though. He kind of really had a wanderlust sense about himself. So after a year, he was off to Chicago, or excuse me, not Chicago, to Colorado, because his parents had moved there. His parents decided that they wanted to go into ranching, so they bought a ranch out in eastern Colorado, and Albert Brooking went to join them. At first, he worked for them, and then he kind of hired himself as a cattle hand to other ranchers around there, and also dabbled a little bit in ironwork. But his lust for adventure was so strong that he jumped at a chance when the Pullman Company out of Denver offered him a job riding the rails. This gave him an opportunity to see the country. His route took him all the way to Oregon, so there's lots of things to see and do along the way. Anytime that the train would stop for a layover or any extended period of stay, he would be out looking for curiosities. He would be out looking for nature and exploring the areas. All the while, he's collecting things. On one of his stops in Denver, he met his future wife, Bertha, and shortly after they were wed, they moved back to Nebraska. Albert immersed himself at that time in grain elevator businesses. At first, he worked at Sedan, and then Norman, Inland, and finally at Trumbull before the museum was founded. Even after the museum was open, he maintained a small hand in the Trumbull business, maybe because he thought it was a fallback if the museum didn't work out. Maybe it was just a little extra cash, because museum work doesn't actually pay very well, even in those days. Slide. So even though he held all these different jobs, he was so passionate about exploring and learning. And it was through these adventures that he made lots of connections and met with collectors and scientists and people that would help him further his knowledge and also to find out where the good stuff was. He would look in these areas for any type of archaeological opportunities. He would look at the natural history of the area. He would look for the animals. And he would gather stuff, and his collection just kept growing and growing. These images are actually some images of him in later life, but it kind of points to his outdoors nature about him. The first image, he is pointing out the Oregon Trail ruts that were around here. The Oregon Trail just went south of Hastings, so he was out pointing them out and was very instrumental in getting Susan Hale's grave marked over in the western part of the county. The middle picture and the right side picture are both pictures where he was out looking for cultural artifacts, Native American artifacts. He did participate in professional digs as well as starting his own, looking for different cultures, particularly the Pawnee in this area. Slide. So like I said, everywhere he went, he was collecting, and pretty soon his homes were bursting at the seams. If you'll look in these pictures, these are two different pictures of his different homes that he had. You see some of the same things in both the pictures, but you can kind of tell that you've got a statue, you've got a bird, you've got some Native American artifacts. He collected everything. Next slide. So when he ended up in Trumbull, he actually built his own house. And for the first time, he had a larger room dedicated just to his collections. And this is what he called his den. Tell you what, Bertha must have been a really patient woman, because I don't know if I could put up with that mess. Next slide, please. So even though he displayed his artifacts and specimens in his home for his own pleasure, and I'm sure he brought people in and showed off all of his goodies to everybody proudly, he still wanted to share with other people. And so we know that through his memoir that he was out there looking for a real museum opportunity. He didn't have capital, he didn't have support for it, and so he turned to displaying some of his collection in places that maybe we wouldn't necessarily think about. So these two pictures show that he was displaying in local businesses here in Hastings. He also took some things to Hastings College and showed them in their library in the basement. They had started kind of a museum there with one of the professors. He even had head mounts and other animal mounts displayed in hotels and stuff around town. At the same time that he's doing this, there's some other things going on in Hastings that the community is starting to talk about. We really kind of need a museum. Adam Breed, who was a large game hunter here, had a show of all of his animal mounts at the auditorium, and people just flocked to Hastings. So people were starting to take notice and thinking that, you know, this could be a moneymaker and a way to possibly grow the community. Albert really wanted a museum of his own, so he took advantage of this opportunity and he made an offer to the city of Hastings. He would help them start the museum if they would fund the building and his salary, and in turn, he would share his large collection. And he did do that and eventually donated it. At first, he was just loaning it to him. I think he was kind of trying it out to see how permanent it was. Next slide, please. So the city of Hastings agreed to support the museum, and they did so with tax dollars, and they still do today. We are a municipal museum, but we became the first in the state of Nebraska and would become the largest between Chicago and Denver, a privilege that we still have today. So the city really didn't have any money to start this venture, but they had land. So they designated the land north of Highland Cemetery, a block of land, for the museum building. But with no money, we didn't have a building or money to build a building. So the school district kind of came to the rescue, and they offered the Hawthorne building, which is the picture on the left. This was a school that was closed. They had built a new building, and this one was sitting empty. So they allowed the museum to come in and display the artifacts there. So articles of incorporation were signed on December in 1926, and just 1 month later, they opened the doors to the public. Albert had moved all of his stuff in, he had set it up and displayed it, and then he also added to it. There were other people that brought in their collections as well. So we had A.T. Hill's gun collection, we had Ben Richards' coin collection. There were other smaller collectors that he allowed to come in and kind of expand that collection. All the while that we were in the Hawthorne building, Albert continued to collect and add to the museum. And it only took 5 years before the museum was bursting at the seams. So once again, the school district came to the rescue and allowed the Morton building, which was a bigger school that had also been abandoned, to be used for the museum. So it took 125 trailer loads to move from the Hawthorne School to the Morton School building in 1932. Next slide, please. These are some of the exhibits that people would have seen as they came into one or the other of these schools. A lot of these exhibits ended up in both of them, but they could see a wide array of artifacts and specimens, a lot of them, like I said, belonging to Albert, but then also some to other collectors as well. The whole time that Albert is doing all of this, he is looking to other museums for help and inspiration. He made connections with people at the Chicago Field Museum, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the American Museum of Natural History, and all of these relationships helped him form his ideas of displaying things, his ideas of collecting. He was able to buy past exhibit pieces from them and any surplus material, particularly Denver. We had a lot of business going back and forth with them. And sometimes we'd even trade things back and forth with these museums. We'd trade for animal mounts or we'd trade for exhibit pieces. So it wasn't always just about money. But it wasn't long before the Morton building was overflowing too. Next slide, please. In 1937, the city of Hastings, at the behest of Albert, was able to finally secure some funding. And this funding came through the Works Project Administration, otherwise known as the WPA. This funding could be used to build the museum. It paid for the construction workers who dug the basement, built the walls, poured the cement, did all of that. It also paid for some of the exhibit work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week because that really was centered on dioramas. But that's where this funding came from. As part of the project, they decided to tear down the Morton School building and salvage materials that were later used in basically constructing exhibit cases. So the picture on the top left, you see the Morton School building and you see the WPA sign. You also see that part of the building is missing, and that's part of that salvage process. So they started digging the basement. At the same time, they're moving the collection to the fairgrounds, which happened to be at that time across the street from the new museum lot, and they were tearing down this building all at the same time. Just as a side note, we know that they used a lot of the Morton School building wood in the exhibit cases. As we've moved exhibit cases or we've had to take exhibit cases out, we find things from floorboards to steps, just about any kind of wood. We found some what looked like clap siding, and I'm not sure that came from Morton because it was a brick building, but we've got all sorts of recycled wood in this building. So if you note the image with the basement there, you'll notice that there's a mule team. Mule teams actually dug the basement. There was no heavy equipment, and they did this in January, in winter, when the ground was probably frozen. So the funding came in 1937, and by December of 37, they had started digging that basement. You can't really see it in these images, but they pulled a big scoop called a Frisco behind them, and it pulled the dirt out in each pass. So if you think about it, how much these mules were doing with this frozen ground and how quickly it went, because the image with the bricks, that's only 6 months later. By June, they were actually building the walls and getting the outside of the building ready to go. So that's pretty amazing, I think. Next slide, please. So it only took about 18 months after the building project started before we had a state-of-the-art museum. We opened to the public in June of 1939 in this building. And some of the features that were kind of unique at the time, but very much forward-thinking for a museum, was the structure was mostly concrete and brick, which offers us a fire-resistant rating. Most of the stuff that's in this building, if it's casework, it's wood. Otherwise, it's made out of fire-resistant material even yet today. We use metal studs when we build walls, and we don't have a lot of lumber in this building in that aspect. You'll also notice that there are very few windows, and part of that is because of the light damage that UV lighting on artifacts causes. And Albert knew all of this stuff because of people he had been talking to, and so this was a really forward-thinking museum at that time. Slide, please. So while the building was under construction and being completed, exhibit work was going on over in that fairgrounds. They closed, like I said, they closed the building. They moved all of the artifacts into the fairgrounds area, and then there was money from the WPA to actually hire people to help with these exhibits as well. So there was about 10 employees, most of them women, who were located at the fairgrounds, and this crew did a lot of the prep work, including cleaning and repairing artifacts, cleaning mounts, making foliage for the new animal dioramas. Again, we'll talk about that next week. And this work, even though the museum opened in '39, this work actually continued on for quite a few years even after the museum opened. So we didn't open fully ready with exhibits from wall to wall. We opened kind of in phases, but the building itself was done and ready for people in 1939. Next slide, please. Again, through all of this work in establishing the museum and maintaining its operations, Albert continued to enjoy the outdoors. He continued to do research. He continued to collect. Those who worked with him remembered him fondly. They often remarked that he was very passionate about his work. He was also very persuasive. He wanted to have something that was really good, but he also had a sense of humor and enjoyed a good laugh. These images here, the first one on the left is his wife, Catherine, and him. They're pretty serious in their bird watching. If you look at that clothing, you know, they had the whole safari thing going on here in Nebraska even. When he was photographed, like the one on the right, he liked to look like he was being very studious and a very serious aspect. We have many pictures of him studying various aspects of our collection. But I really like the lower image. It's one of the few images we have of him that's more on the lighter side, that people talk about who knew him, that he had this sense of humor. This bison was actually mounted by Albert. We don't know the exact purpose of this image. Maybe he was demonstrating how well and he built his mounts and they were very strong that all these men could sit on it. Or maybe there was more of a subliminal message that, you know, men were conquering the wild beast. But either way, I kind of like to imagine Albert gingerly climbing onto that animal and saying, "Come on, fellas, join me up here." Because everybody talked about, you know, his sense of humor and his knack for telling jokes and playing tricks on people and stuff. Next slide, please. So Albert did finally get his museum, but he was only able to enjoy the new building for about 7 years. There's many versions of his death that abound, but what we know for sure, what we know as facts, is that he was working on a diorama when he fell and he hurt himself, and he was hurt bad enough to be hospitalized. The newspaper reported about a week after that he was recovering well and everything was looking fine, but then all of a sudden 2 weeks later he passed away. I like to speculate that he possibly had pneumonia. Back in that time, people convalesced and they didn't get up like they do today. Today you have a surgery and you're up in 2 hours. You know, back then they didn't do that. They thought laying in bed was better. Don't know that for sure, but that's just what I kind of wonder about. But he had planned for his inevitable death. He convinced city leaders to include a crypt for his body in the basement floor of this museum when it was built. He was buried right there in that crypt, and it's where he keeps his watchful eye on his precious dream. We do have a bronze plaque on his grave. It says, "If you seek my monument, look around." And it's obvious that his legacy is still here, and it's a very important part of the community. And like I said earlier, we are still one of the largest municipal museums in the region, and we are definitely the largest between Denver and Chicago. You can see these people that have enjoyed our exhibits all around. Some of the dioramas, some of the newer things that we've added in the past. Slide, please. So Albert's dream didn't die with him. After he passed, 4 additions have been made to the building. The first was the J.M. Mcdonald Planetarium, 1958. Was one of the first planetariums to show on a daily basis and had a nice star projector, as you can see in the left-sided picture. This is the J.M. Mcdonald Planetarium. It was funded by the J.M. Mcdonald Foundation, and they have continually offered money and grants to us for operations and upgrades in that facility. The original plan for the museum was that it would be in the shape of the H for Hastings, but unfortunately the next edition couldn't be made in that shape of H because it was very cost prohibitive. So instead of having a cross section in another section of the building, we ended up having it just butt up against us. In 1972, that building was open to the public and houses today our People on the Plains exhibit, a changing gallery, and where Kool-Aid is. It also added some much needed workspace, so we have a workroom and we have a dock area as well. The third edition in 1985 was for much needed collection storage space, plus a hands-on room that is the Nature Nook today. Slide, please. Our last edition was an IMAX theater in 1993. We are no longer an IMAX theater. We allowed our contract to expire in 2001, which opened us up to a lot of more opportunities to diversify our showings. We still feature large format films, but we have the capability of showing second run Hollywood films, independent films, virtual connections, and so many more things. The Hastings Museum would not be what it is today if it hadn't been for Albert and his passion, his perseverance, and really his partnership with the city of Hastings. Next slide. So we are still adjusting to our new normals, but we do have events going on. We have an upcoming digital scavenger hunt in the downtown area on September 11th. We are still showing large format films. We have Back from the Brink and Nature Makers, and we have opened up our planetarium by reservation only. Next slide, please. So I encourage you, if you want to come and visit the place in person, please do so. We do have different hours, so please check our hours and check our website for any changes or details on scheduling. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you so much. I could actually listen to you talk all day.
Oh.
The history is amazing, and I knew none of this. But again, that's enough to excite me to actually want to learn more. So I'm glad we get more opportunities to do so. I do have a couple questions before we end for today.
Great.
And again, as I said, I loved hearing all of your explanation of things. Do you give guided tours there at the museum?
We do periodic tours. It's kind of changed with COVID, and I'm sure it'll come back, but we had something called detours, and basically it was something that we offered every day. We haven't started offering them again yet, but be on the lookout. Check our webpage often, where we pick out certain things and we talk about different aspects of the museum for anybody that's in the building. We also have done a lot of behind the scenes tours for people who have made reservations, or sometimes we raffle that as an option to come and take a look. So we do things on occasion.
Wonderful. And tell me, how many floors is the museum? Is it all on one floor, or is there several?
We are on 3 floors. One is a basement, but we are on 3 levels.
Wow.
Lots of space.
That's great. Again, the history itself was priceless. I appreciate hearing all about it, but I really can't wait for these next 4 sessions where we get to go inside the museum and take a look at some of your collections. So again, Teresa, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you and hearing all about the dioramas that you have with inside the museum next week, which will be the 4th or the 14th of September. Let me check my calendar. The 9th of September.
9th. Yeah.
There you go. The 9th at 11 a.m. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too.